The former US ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, has written an article accusing Kevin Rudd of being more interested in regulating the economy than reducing carbon emissions. John Bolton joins us now from Washington. Mr. Bolton, good morning.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Now, you're suggesting that Kevin Rudd is not the climate change saviour he presents himself to the Australian people and in Copenhagen to the international community.
Well, I think it's typical not just of the Prime Minister but of a number of other advocates of the kinds of solutions being discussed at Copenhagen, that these solutions, greater government control of the economy, greater government regulation, greater government interference in all of our daily lives, has been something that many of these people have believed in for years, for decades, even before global warming was much of an issue. And I think the real point is that whatever your view of the extent and causes and effects of global warming, the kinds of solutions being discussed at Copenhagen, I think, are both unrealistic and unlikely to produce the results intended.
What's unrealistic about an emissions trading scheme like the one proposed by the Australian government?
Well, number one, certainly Australia is free to put into effect any limitation it wants on carbon emissions. The question is whether Australia acting alone is going to make the slightest bit of difference worldwide. And I think we can see from the discussions in and leading up to Copenhagen that countries like India and China and others in the developing world are not going to put any effective limit on their carbon emissions and thereby limit their economic growth. I think it's questionable, in fact, whether many countries of the developed world, despite their rhetoric, are really going to be prepared to crunch their economies, particularly beginning in the middle of this recession.
So from that I take it you're not particularly optimistic of anything tangible, anything realistic coming out of the Copenhagen talks?
No, I think there'll be a lot of rhetoric, and that goes to my basic point. If people are talking about solutions that are not going to happen, and acting as if that's really going to do something about global warming, that is not a serious effort. And what it says to me is that there's another agenda in play, one that's philosophically attuned to increased government regulation, whether there's global warming, global cooling, or no change at all.
Just so we're clear, do you believe the planet faces a peril from climate change?
Well, I'm prepared to assume for these purposes that there is global warming, that it's largely anthropogenic, and that the net effects of global warming are negative. I take all that as given for purposes of this debate. My point is what's being talked about in Copenhagen, not as the problem, but as the solution to the problem, is doomed to failure.
The US President Barack Obama is set to arrive in Copenhagen over the next 24 to 48 hours. He, of course, is going to be arriving there with one hand tied behind his back because, as you know, his cap-and-trade scheme is held up at the moment in the US Congress.
Well, it's more than held up. It's in deep, deep trouble. He was able to ram it through the House of Representatives because of the large majority that the Democrats have. I see zero chance of that being adopted in the Senate. And indeed, public opinion in the United States, we still have a democracy, public opinion is turning more and more against the very proposals that the President is endorsing. So I don't see any realistic possibility that the United States is prepared to adopt the kinds of policies being discussed by those already there in Copenhagen.
So Kevin Rudd and other world leaders can't expect, therefore, from your point of view, that Barack Obama can take the usual US world leadership position on climate change at a summit like Copenhagen?
Well, it depends on what you mean by world leadership. Personally, I believe in stronger individual freedom, and one of the reasons that I'm concerned about some of the schemes being discussed at Copenhagen is that it would dramatically limit freedom around the world. I think that's going to have limited effect on global warming, but a lot of effect on the quality of our lives.
As a former ambassador to the United Nations, I'm interested to get your view on the role China is playing at this conference. As you know, there are very deep rifts emerging between China and the US in particular over what role China should play, both as a member of the international community and as a growing economic superpower, and also, of course, as the world's greatest polluter. What's your assessment on where China's negotiating position is heading to?
Well, I think China is advancing what it sees as its national interest, and that is to protect the possibility of increased economic growth. That's the reason I think there's effectively no chance whatever that China will agree to any serious limits, serious verifiable limits on its carbon emissions. And if China doesn't agree to that, India is not going to agree to it, other developing countries are not going to agree to it, and there isn't going to be any effective agreement globally. Now, if that's the case, and the politics seem to me to be very clear, the advocates of these kinds of programs are simply butting their head into a wall. They're not going to get the agreement they want. They're not going to limit carbon emissions, and they're not going to affect global warming. So if the path ahead pursuing that line, pursuing that approach is failure, perhaps those concerned about global warming ought to try something else.
What other options are there, for argument's sake, if this summit ends in failure? There isn't certainly a legally binding treaty or even a framework document. What do you suggest world leaders do in terms of combating what most people agree is a severe threat to the planet?
Well, you know, that's why I say I take this as a given that global warming is a threat. I think there's obviously an intense debate on that, but taking it as a given, if these approaches are not going to work, then I think those who are concerned should look at alternatives, what are frequently called resilience strategies, that assume that carbon will continue to go up and that you take steps that you can afford and that are doable here and now to mitigate the effects of that. The Dutch, for example, are not crying out for more transfers from other developed countries. They're preparing to strengthen their extraordinary system of dikes and protection against high sea levels. I think others should follow the Dutch example.
Now, somebody who's been involved in more than your fair share of international negotiations, I'm keen to get your assessment of the dynamics at this conference. Of course, we saw the walkout yesterday of the G77 nations. Do you believe there's a bit of positioning, a bit of pre-conclusion theatrics involved here?
Sure. Look, I'll tell you what the outcome is going to be in Copenhagen. They're going to declare victory. It's going to be a huge step forward. There'll be a very important agreement signed. Everybody will agree that it's a major step. Now, whether anything actually flows from that or not is very much open to question. But this is the way the UN does business. I had a saying when I was in New York that all of the ambassadors there believed in the theory, we never fail in New York. Whatever happens, we report back to our governments, we've had another success, more progress, everything's going fine. And I think that's what's going to come out of Copenhagen. That may or may not have any resemblance to what actually is going on in the real world.
John Bolton, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.